Well, why do you want an MBA?
Tell me about yourself.
Do you have any questions
do you have for me?
The biggest mistake people make here is not researching enough and being too generic.
You will be asked, why do you want an MBA? Why is this the right school for us? How will you contribute?
Traditionally, there were the questions, what's your greatest strength? What's your biggest weakness? How do you approach those?
Situation, task, action, result.
The MBA interview. 3 words that strike fear in many applicants, but it doesn't have to. Yes, the stakes are high, and there are many common MBA interview questions that you can certainly prepare for. That's exactly what we'll be talking about today with mbaMission Managing Director Gavriella Semaya and Jessica Shklar. Okay, Gavi, I'm about ready to interview you. So that first question is?
Tell me about yourself.
Okay, so Gavi, tell me about yourself.
So I was born in Montreal and I went to college at Harvard in Cambridge or Boston.
That's great. This is a terrible answer.
After college, I started to work in marketing and eventually made my way into fashion, where I spent the majority of my career at companies like Kate Spade, Lafleur. I then got my MBA at Cornell Tech. And since then, I have been here at mbaMission, where I help applicants get into their dream business schools.
That's great. And Jessica, what made that a much better answer the second time around?
It was much more thematic, right? When Gavi started out, it really just talked about I was born in, and then I went here. There's nothing that the admissions reader really couldn't have told from the resume, maybe where she was born, but everything else is just straightforward. A really good answer to tell me about yourself should go deeper than what's on the resume and talk about motivations. I really like my clients to take a thematic approach. Instead of just saying, let me give you a chronological, say, there are 2 driving themes that have structured my activities. Or to understand me, there's a sort of key decisions that you need to know that have driven me. And so if you start out that answer with a thematic overview and then fill in the blanks, the admissions listener, the interviewer, has so much more to hold on to and more interest, and they'll remember you better.
It's not meant to be a verbal recap of your resume,
right? It's
not meant to just be saying that out loud. Essentially, you want to provide new insights, so the motivations, the reason for your decisions.
Okay, that makes sense. And frequently after tell me about yourself, what's the next question, Jessica?
The next question quite often is, well, why do you want an MBA?
And Gavi, why do you want an MBA?
Well, I've really been interested in the sustainability side of the retail industry over the last few years. It's one of the largest polluters, and so I'd like to transition into sustainability. In order to do that, I need better understanding of the primary concerns of ESG, supply chain management, and the leadership skills to drive change. And I think an MBA will be a really valuable way to develop those skills and help me pivot into this career.
That's great. That is absolutely great. So if you answer the question, why an MBA, Jessica, what should you be looking to say and what you'd be looking not to say?
Well, I think what's most important is that the answer is complete in itself, which means giving context. So just to talk about what you want to do doesn't have credibility to it, because the interviewer, if they haven't read your essays, if all they've seen is your resume, they don't have a context as to whether that's a realistic goal. So I think that the career goal, the why an MBA essay, should really span from this is what I've done, and this is why that will contribute to where I'm going in the short term and the long term. And that sets you up to talk about, and I need the MBA to fill in the gaps.
That's right. That's right. And frequently after the why MBA question, it comes to why
us?
That particular business goal.
And I think the biggest mistake people make here is not researching enough and being too generic and telling the school what they already know.
Right.
I want to go to Columbia because it's located in New York. Well, they go to work there every day. They know that. So why?
Because you're a unique school, and I like your unique network, and I like your unique student body.
Right. So I think it's really important to have, this is one of the things I ask my clients to write down during their interview prep. Don't tell the school what they already know. Instead, tell the school how those facts that they know are relevant to you.
Why are they relevant?
Right.
So it's not, I want to go to school because it's in Columbia because it's in New York, but Columbia's location in New York is exciting to me because in order for me to fill in the gaps from what I've done to where I'm going, I need these resources, which I can only get by the Executives in Residence program, which brings practitioners from Wall Street to campus. It's that level of specificity.
Absolutely. And I also remind people the interview is really a very human process.
Right.
Because the reality is, as you talk about these things, if you start sounding canned, or if you start sounding like you read it off their website, then suddenly it's sort of just off-putting, if nothing else.
Right, right. And I think the other thing to remember is that for the most part, the person interviewing you is a volunteer. They're an alum or they're as a student, have chosen to dedicate time to helping you and helping the school assess you and helping you get in when there are thousands of other demands on their time.
Right.
And that means they love the school and they're excited about sharing about it and they're excited about meeting you. And so you want to meet that excitement, not with a feeling of they're judging me, but this is someone that I want to talk to and this is someone I want to share with.
Right.
Bring that
This is a
excitement to it.
conversation I'm excited to have because I'm genuinely interested in your school and I have all these thoughts about it and so on. Right. And you don't want to sound canned either because then a follow-up question comes and you're stumped.
Right.
You can't
That's
explain why the executive residence program is valuable to you.
Right. But clients who write out all the answers and memorize them can't think on the fly and they get more panicked and they
sure
much
do.
in
The
their
client
head.
who lists
sure
the
do.
course number.
Yeah.
That course number is going to change anyway. That's not
And no one knows what
right.
it is.
And anybody
Right.
can look it up. That's not doesn't tell me anything about why this school is right for you.
Right.
Right.
In fact, I will tell my clients very specifically, don't send me anything you've written up. Just don't send it to me. At the end of the day, it's just going to be your worst enemy.
Right.
You're
Now
gonna
you
try
can
to- you're-
bullet point and you can plan it.
I tell people to have talking points sometimes, yes, but not a script. I think that's the difference.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
No, I think that's right. So how do you actually prepare for a one-on-one interview?
Well, I usually do, 1 to 2 prep sessions. I do one initial prep session where I talk through the answers and I tell them what to look for and they break down kind of what are the key talking points you want to hit for these sort of basic questions. And then that sets the stage for all of the interviews because with the exception of HBS and Wharton, Wharton does ask this, but you will be asked, why do you want an MBA? Why is this the right school for us? How will you contribute? Right. So it's worth delving into those and kind of making sure you flesh them out. But after that, you want to be extemporaneous. And so it's the unscripted mock questions that help.
That makes sense.
I tell my clients to do what I call the coffee shop exercise. Right. And I tell them, block off 2 or 3 hours, take your resume to a coffee shop, and look at a bullet point. That bullet point was maybe a paragraph when you first wrote it. And you might have spent 6 months getting to the point where you could summarize that experience in a line and a half on a resume. So stop at that first bullet point and ask yourself, how did this project get started? Right. What would I have done differently? Who was my biggest supporter? Who was my biggest barrier? What did I learn from this? Ask yourself these questions and do that. Then after 10 minutes, move on to the second bullet point. And what you're doing is reminding yourself of stories that you haven't thought about in months or years, so that your brain is nimble, that when someone asks a question, let's say they ask you your greatest accomplishment and you give your canned answer, and then they ask another one, and then they ask a third, you need to not be thinking for the first time, but prepare. And that's the best preparation. Right. By the way, I also tell my clients to reread their brainstorming document.
Yep.
That's great
exactly.
preparation.
I think of it like you want an arsenal of stories
Exactly.
that you can sort of deploy as needed because they also apply to different things. Leadership question can also be a challenge question and so on. And so you don't want to overly sort of pigeonhole an answer for a specific question.
I sometimes do the challenge of asking my client to take one story and then I'll say to them,
frame
how
it in
would you
different ways.
frame this? I actually wrote up a slide for this once where there was a diamond and it was like taking different facets of it and showing the experience from different ways.
Right. Plus, most clients have already done some of this in terms of the essays they crafted. If you apply it to multiple schools, frequently you're using very similar examples, except you're presenting them in different ways.
Right.
Certainly for why this school, if there was an essay related to that, I will tell my clients, go back and read your essay. Remember the classes you listed, the programs you listed, and so on. Paraphrase it. Don't, memorize it. But
I'll tell them to go to the press release office of a portion of the website of the school. Because if anything big happened in the last month, they got a new dean, they got a huge donation, they should know about that. And so the worst thing is to be completely unprepared for something that's in the public news.
And I also tell clients, certainly try to find out who you will be interviewed by. Because it's going to be a fundamentally different interview. If it is a current student who is in the same industry that you are, what is that interview going to look like? Versus someone who's 20 or 30 years out of the school, who graduated so long ago, that if you ask them what's happening in the school, they don't have no idea. You probably have a better idea of what's going on at the school.
And I think that really plays into one of the most fearsome questions people have, which is, where the interviewer at the end of the interview says, do you have any questions
do you have for me?
And I think those are fundamentally different, whether you're interviewed by an admissions officer who's read your whole application, a student, or an alum. But the bottom line for all of those, to me, is you want to be positive and you don't want to trick the interviewer, and you don't want to ask any obvious questions. So obvious questions: how did I do? What do you think my odds are?
Yes.
What are the next steps from here?
Right.
Don't ask those.
Right.
And the trick questions would be things like, I noticed that in Finance 622, in the third module, you guys use an old-fashioned way of calculating. And by the way, that's a specific question someone tried on me as during the mock once.
Right.
Paraphrased. No one is going to know that, even a student. So
and it's not valuable for you to learn the answer
Think
to
about
that.
sincere questions, sincere, thoughtful questions.
And don't be negative. Right. Don't say, like, I understand that you guys really struggled to adapt after COVID. How would you do things differently? Right. That's not a positive or constructive. I tell people, positive observation and ask them to confirm it. Right. So if you're talking to a student, you can say, I loved when I walked around campus, that so many students came up and asked me if I was lost, asked me if I was visiting, if they could help in any way. Have you found that same positive, collaborative, helpful nature to be universal?
Right.
Right? Ask them.
Right. Other good questions that you like to ask?
I like to ask, particularly if it's a recent alum or a student, what was the most valuable part of your experience if you had to pick something? Or what's something that you wish you knew going into the program?
Right. What surprised you the most about the program?
Right. Yeah. I also sometimes will have them suggest that they ask something like, of all the demands on your time, you chose to do this. Right. Why? What about the school?
Right, or how did you prioritize? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's right. Or if it's an alumni, how are you still engaged with the school?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. What about the school makes you still want to do interviews this long after? We should say also that there are some schools, Harvard, which you mentioned, NYU, MIT, and London Business School, and a couple of the other European programs, where it is different because the interviewer will have read your whole application. Yeah. So we're really talking the majority of what we call blind interviews.
Jessica, what are some of the other questions that you frequently see?
Behavioral questions is really kind of the heart of the interview. And these are questions that usually you'll know it's a behavioral question if it starts out with, tell me about a time when, or tell me about a situation in which. And these are really trying to delve and understand your behavior. What did you do in a specific situation? And I think the problem most people face when they answer one of these questions is getting so lost in the details that they forget to get to the end. Right. So when I was trained, I worked at American Express, and when I moved up to management level, they sent me to manager training, and we were taught this method for behavioral questions. So this is not an MBA thing or not a business school thing. This is a really comprehensive tool to help you give a comprehensive answer, which is the STAR method: situation, task, action, result. So situation is the big picture context. The company was trying to form a merger with someone else. Then the task is the second level. That's more what we use specifically. And my responsibility was to manage the due diligence among 20 different targets. Then action. I took the following 3 steps, and then R is the result. This is what happened. And no one, except possibly MIT, is ever going to listen to those questions, to your answers, to see if you hit on all those points. It's an organizational tool for you to make sure that you are getting from the beginning to the end of the story in about 2 minutes.
Right.
I often remind clients, too, that they can ask follow-up questions. If you're worried about whether a detail is essential, try taking it out and see if the story still makes sense. Right? If it still makes sense, then you probably don't need it to get your story across.
And you, as the interviewee, can also ask if you can give more detail. You can say at the end of that answer, I'd actually really love to share more about
or I'd be
the action
to.
Yeah, would you? Is that something you'd be interested in? And they might say no, but it might give you a chance. It is a conversation.
Behavioral questions are very intimidating to people, and I always remind them, listen, there is no wrong answer. At the end of the day, the greatest challenge you ever faced is the greatest challenge you ever faced.
Right.
They're not going to come back to you and say, actually, I think this other challenge in your life was more challenging.
Well, and that's the key thing is they don't know anything about you.
That's right.
So they're not assessing whether you picked the best topic. They're just assessing how you convey it.
You control the narrative here, right? And so you can choose what to highlight and what to emphasize and how to frame certain things.
And interviews are fun because you get to spend a half hour talking about your favorite subject, which is you. I love interviews. I love talking about myself.
And listen, it's also important to remember for most, the vast majority of the schools, it's not a do or die interview.
Right.
It is simply one data point. Sometimes it's weighted more heavily, sometimes less heavily.
I think I've had people who walked out feeling like they had destroyed the interview, done terribly, and gotten in. And I've had people who felt like they did amazingly well and not get in.
Yeah.
It's really easy to think that if you got to the interview stage and then you did well on the interview, you're in. But instead, it's as you said, is one more data point. The interview, the entire package goes back to the admissions committee and gets assessed again with one more piece of information.
Traditionally, there were the questions, what's your greatest strength? What's your biggest weakness? How do you approach those?
One of the important things about this question is that you don't just want to list a strength. You want to explain why this is a strength or why it's valuable, why it's useful, right? So I'm really resourceful. Whenever there's kind of a project with a lot of ambiguous information or a lack of information, I'm really good at finding ways to get started and help the team move forward.
But I think giving details to support that is
Yes, an
really
example,
important.
if you can, is great.
Yeah, ask me my biggest weakness.
What is your greatest weakness?
I work too hard.
No, you don't. That is a terrible weakness.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things I tell
Just
people.
too dedicated.
I'm such a perfectionist that I have to understand that not everyone has my level. So there are fake weaknesses like we just mentioned.
Humble brags.
Humble brags,
Yes.
yes.
Yeah.
And there are also devastating ones. Well, I used to steal petty cash, but now I learned
right,
not to.
right.
We don't do those either.
I'm a reformed kleptomaniac.
And then there are other ones that I think are fake weaknesses in that they are ones that you wouldn't be expected to have, right? Once I hit the next promotion, I'm going to have to be a rainmaker and bring in clients, but I don't do that now.
Right.
Well, you're not expected to. So don't shy away from talking about a real weakness. It should be something that you're not great, that you struggled with, it had an impact. Business schools are trying to get to know the human being. They know everyone was not born perfect.
I think it's helpful to show that you're
And
thinking
you've
about
made-
how you can work on it or are making progress, right?
Absolutely.
It's fine to say, you know what, public speaking is something that's really challenging for
But
me.
this is what I've
but
done
I've
to-
been getting in front of, increasingly large groups, and I've been, practicing with a coach, and I'm getting more comfortable with it every day.
I use the acronym WISP, W-I-S-P. Give a real weakness, a real one. The I is the impact. What would have happened if you did not fix that? What would have been the impact? Were you sloppy with details on a project and it would have been embarrassing, or you don't speak well in public, or you don't speak up in meetings and people don't know that you're capable? So what is the impact? So W is the weakness, I is the impact. S is steps that you have taken to work on that weakness. And P is proof that you have made progress. Again, it's a structure. I made that up. No one is sitting there saying,
fact,
did you do this?
Jessica, let's pause because this is new to me too. So WISP, tell me again what it is.
Do you want me to give you an example?
Yes, I would.
So my biggest weakness is that I interrupt people. And some of that comes from a place of enthusiasm, and some of it is simply bad habit. And that was the W. I started to realize how that affected people when I became a manager and had a team under me. And when they and I would share ideas, I often cut them off. I thought I was just sharing, but they felt that I was cutting them off and not listening. And it started to really impact our relationship, where they didn't bother giving ideas anymore because I would cut them off. And so I knew I had to fix this. So the first thing I did was tell them that I really appreciated hearing that, and that I was going to work on it. We came up with a really silly secret word that if they said jelly bean during a meeting, because it was silly, I couldn't possibly be angry with them. But it wasn't their responsibility to fix it. It was really mine. So I also made a point I came up with some mantras for myself, and before every meeting or conversation, I would literally remind myself, don't talk. I also started carrying water. So that if I felt tempted to talk, I would take a sip. And in the end, they really appreciated my honesty about it. And I did start to get better because my interrupting became something that I could control. But I was not perfect. I will never be perfect because it still comes from this place of enthusiasm. But I now know when I have to be more disciplined about it because of the impact on other people.
And again, business schools are not looking for perfect.
Right.
They aren't.
But did you
looking
see
for
how
humans.
I walked through the four phases in that answer? That's what I coach my clients on.
Yep. And again, WISP. And if you want to try to start figuring out your own WISP, by all means, start with a 30-minute free consultation with Jessica Shklar, Gavriella Semaya, me, or any number of our MBA missions consultants. So Gavi, one of the toughest questions is usually the last question, which is what other schools are you applying to? How do you even approach that?
Partly, I think, with some degree of honesty, but not necessarily total transparency, right? I mean, they don't know. There's no way for them to verify this. But I think the intent is to understand, what are you looking for in schools? So I caution my clients, not to name schools that are, drastically out of range. So something that is an extreme sort of safety school for you that might show that you're not confident about applying to this school, or something that's an extreme reach that, might indicate that you're likely to go to that school if you're admitted. So I think parallel schools. Yeah. And I also think about continuity. Right. If you're applying to Columbia, don't say that you might not want to say that you also applied to Tuck, which is in the middle of nowhere.
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
There should be some consistency in the thought process behind the schools you've chosen.
That's right. I do the same. I tell them, mention 2 or 3 peer schools. Then give the logic that makes that grouping intelligent. Right. And then pivot. This is my first choice because, and give those specifics.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. I frequently say, look for the 4-letter schools. Tuck, Haas, Duke, and Ross. Why are they pairs for each other, besides the fact that they're 4 letters? One of the reasons is they're small schools. They are fairly far away from major metropolitan areas. Yale, maybe yes, maybe no, but they're also great cultures. So when you say I'm looking to apply to all 4 of those schools, it's like, yes, that makes sense. If, however, you tell me I'm looking to apply to Tuck and Wharton, I'm like, I'm sort of scratching my head about that one.
I sometimes will use the phrase, I am only thinking of. It's not of their business every place you're applying. Right. So if you just give 1 or 2 peer schools, and if you've been rejected already, you don't have to mention that school. It's not, I don't think it's a fair question, but they don't ask me about it, so they're going to ask it anyway. Although we are seeing less and less of that, I think.
So.
Less frequently.
Yeah. It's rare for us to hear about that.
I think schools have started to figure out that it's not a really insightful question.
And it lends itself to be gamed.
Exactly.
I think that's really it. There's certainly one question that I find personally very intimidating, and that is, what else do you want me to ask you? Or what else should I have asked you? Or what else do you want to share with me? I always think to myself, well, actually, it's an interview, and I'm sort of ready to be done. I don't particularly want to share anything else with you. But, Gavi, how do we even approach that question?
I think about, sort of key things themes or values or intentions that I want to communicate to the admissions committee or to my interviewer, I should say, that maybe we didn't discuss yet. Or, I'd really love to talk about my involvement with X group that's been a really meaningful part of my life, and here's why.
Or if you have covered everything, then I use that as a recap. I will say, thank you so much for asking that. I really wanted to make sure I addressed point 1, point 2, point 3, and I feel like this did that in a really comprehensive way, and thank you. Right. So I use it to recap. Right. And to me, this is a shorter version of walk me through your resume or tell me about yourself. It's just kind of the major themes you want to hit.
Yeah. I frequently have my clients say, you're my first choice. What else do you want to know about me? What else would you like me to know? It's like, I want to go to Columbia for the following reasons.
Yeah.
And that's it. If there's one thing that you certainly want to remember after your interview, it is sending a thank you note. And what do you say in a thank you note?
So first, an emailed thank you note is fine, but get it out quickly. Typically, recommend interviewers are asked to submit their form 24 hours later. And so you want to have that good impression be made. A thank you note should not be long. I would keep it maybe 3 or 4 sentences, certainly no more than a quarter of a page. Right. It's brief. It's just a thank you. Mention 1 or 2 things you really enjoyed about the interview. And then if there was anything specific that you guys talked about, a restaurant or a kind of music or dogs or something, you can bond over that and then thank them at the end. Yeah. That's really
sometimes include a reiteration of, your excitement about this school.
Right.
I generally don't advise using it to make up for what you think of as a bad answer because they may not have thought it was a bad answer.
Right, that's true.
And it comes across as very defensive.
Right. Definitely also remember to get the name of your interviewer.
Right.
You will be surprised as far as how many people leave their interview and say, who was that again? And that is definitely not the direction you want to go.
But I will say Harvard is very clear that they do not want thank you notes. So,
they have the post-interview reflection, which is sort of not a thank you note, but it is your follow-up.
Right. And then Wharton, because of the team-based discussion, you would not be sending that either, even though you get 10 minutes one-on-one.
And we're going to have a lot more to say about the Harvard Business School interview in particular, except that really brings up the subject of what is called unblinded interviews or comprehensive interviews, which is this notion here you're interviewing with somebody who has probably read your application, probably knows a little bit about you already. So how do you approach that interview?
So the schools that are not blind, so blind means the interviewer sees only your resume. They will never see your essays, your videos. They might not even have the resume in advance if it's a student and you're interviewing in person. They might literally pick up your resume from a box as they're walking into the admissions office to call you in. Non-blind interviews are comprehensive. The interviewer will have read everything. They might have spent a couple of hours on your application, on your recommendations, any videos, all of your essays. The schools that do non-blind interviews are Harvard, MIT, and NYU, and then some European programs. And those are harder to prepare for, but they're much more personal. Yeah. There's very few rote questions. They really are delving into your experience. The best way to prep is to remember your story. Go through your resume, go through your brainstorming, reread your essays, read essays for other schools, and just be able to talk about why things happened and what your motivations were, and be prepared to talk about your goals.
Right.
I think be prepared, to answer honestly. I mean, in some ways, these are more intimidating, but easier because you're not, they're not forced sort of structured answers about a particular story. Oftentimes they're asking the why behind a decision, or did you consider this? And if you answer honestly and thoughtfully, you'll be fine.
Right.
Yeah, and honestly, it's really sort of cool. Gabi, you now have 30 minutes. Tell me everything you want to for yourself.
Right.
I know you better than anyone else. I just want to ask you some very significant, serious questions. What do you say? Jessica, if you could tell me anything about yourself, what would you tell me?
No, those are pretty intimidating questions, but it's much more directed than that, where they will really say, I understand that you did this, this, and this. What happened? What drew it together? How did this happen?
Did you face any pushback? And if so, how did you handle it? What's the biggest challenge in this industry that you're targeting, et cetera?
And probably the other extreme of interviews, aside from the Wharton team-based discussion, is Darden, University of Virginia, where they don't even see your resume at any point. And literally, it is completely blind, where the interviewer...
And they say, take 15 minutes at the beginning.
Yeah,
take 15 minutes to tell me about yourself.
Yeah, and it's just free form. And then they'll ask follow-up questions based on... So you have complete control over how you structure that interview. And that's a whole different beast.
Right. At the MBA Mission podcast, we know nothing about freeform. But thank you very much for joining us today. This is Harold, Jessica, and Gavi.
Thank you.